Okay, good afternoon. We'd like to thank the organizers, ICSC and WWF, and also the UP School of Economics for organizing this event. We actually, one of the objectives of EPDP is really to encourage discussions on policy issues with regards to the energy sector. And before I start my presentation, we've been circulating our comments on the comments that was circulated, and we said there that we've actually presented this paper several times, in fact 13 times already, and we've received about 20 comments from various individuals and institutions, and we'd like to thank them because we've taken them into account. Most of them we've taken them into account, and some are noted as we pursue other research endeavors under EPDP. So with that, thank you again, and let me start by presenting to you the mandate of EPDP, or Energy Policy and Development Program. It was really conceived to provide inputs to energy policy that is conducive to sustained growth and poverty reduction. So with that context, that's why we participated in the endeavor of this exercise, Ambition Natin 2040, that was spearheaded by the National Economic and Development Authority. So hence this paper called Filipino 2040, Energy, Power, Security and Competitiveness. And this is a co-authored paper. The co-authors are here, Professor Raul Pavella, Professor Rolly Danao, Professor Ruping Alonso, and Professor Dennis Mapa. So if you have other questions, they will also answer them later in the open forum. So let me start by providing you the main takeaway of this paper. So the paper is neither pro-fossil fuels nor pro-renewable. It is all about an energy policy, like what I've said, that is conducive to attaining the Ambition Natin 2040. It illustrates the appropriate fuel mix that respects the evolution of prices of fuel over time. We highlight the role of competitiveness among various resources. So, as mentioned earlier, this was part of an effort of the Ambition Natin 2040. And I will just briefly tell you what it is. Yusek Navarro here will tell us all about this exercise. In that NEDA survey, they did a survey among the youth, actually, who would have a stake by 2040. So the result was, the Filipinos would want a maginhawa, panatag at matatag na buhay, simple and comfortable life by 2040. So for us economists, we try to translate this in economic terms. So it's a vision. So it's not real. So what do we want to achieve in 2040? So we try to translate that. What's the vision in 2040? Translating that maginhawa, panatag, and maginhawa, panatag, and mapayapang buhay. For us, it means having a GDP per capita of about 316,000 by 2040 from where it is today, which is about 74,000. Growth of GDP per capita would have to grow by about 5.96 per year, which is a departure from what we've seen in the last 25 years, which is 4%. GDP growth would have to grow about 7% per year for the next 25 years. So this is something that we have attained only in 2010 to 2015 on average. So visioning up to 2040 affords decision makers with a perspective that can guide the choice of present responses. So from there, so that's the economic vision. The question for the energy sector is what is required from the energy sector to attain this vision. Let me just give you a background that this paper is just part of the thematic papers towards the ambition. So there are also papers on urban planning, transport, if I'm not mistaken, education, and also the political economy. So this is just one part of the technical paper supporting the Filipino 2040. So the challenge for the sector, so if we want to achieve that 7% growth, is the sourcing and timing of additional capacity in meeting the growing consumption and at the same time bringing the cost of power down. So the goal, we're going to repeat it over and over again since the Filipinos would want to have a maginhawa and mapayapang buhay, the goal is to improve the well-being of the Filipinos. So one indicator here that we're putting out is the price of electricity. But towards the end, it's really food security that would matter. And food security would have three dimensions: affordability, accessibility, and also reliability. But for now, we're just focusing on the price of electricity. Why is that? Here is comparison of residential and industrial prices among these countries. So Philippines has one of the highest power costs in ASEAN. We can say that we're losing out in comparison on the cost of doing business. So whenever we show this particular slide, we always get a comment that it's not really an apple and to apple comparison, given that only Singapore and the Philippines is where the electricity industry is deregulated, whereas all the others are still vertically integrated. Our response to that is, at the end of the day, it's the price that the investor will consider. Okay, so that's why it still matters. Okay, now when we look at what constitute what we're paying, so now our bill is already unbundled. So if you look at it across the customer class or type, residential, commercial, and industrial, a big portion of the bill that we're paying is going to the generation. So, and then 27% would be about transmission, 27, 5, and 9 there would be about the transmission and distribution, and then the remainder would be goes to taxes and subsidies. So overall, the average is about 54% goes to the generation sector, and 47% of that bill for residential goes to the generation sector. So it's a huge chunk of what we're paying. So that's why for this paper, we're focusing mainly on that part of the bill that we're paying. When we read the literature, there's also a lot of inefficiencies on transmission and distribution. So that's another area that we should look into. And I encourage scholars, especially students, to look into that part of this sector. But for now, the focus is on the generation sector. So given that, so let me just show you. So this is what we call the strong and vs the weak growth. So if we want to be considered as middle or high income countries, this is what we've shown earlier, that the growth has to be about 7%. So the weak growth is what we're calling as going business as usual. So if we continue to grow just 4%, then we will just follow the business as usual path. So given these two scenarios for the economy, the strong and the weak growth, what does it mean for the electricity consumption? Of course, we know that electricity is a major input to production. So if you want to grow, for sure, you would need to consume more electricity. So obviously, here we forecast what would be the electricity consumption if we follow the strong growth scenario, and what would be the electricity consumption if we follow the weak growth scenario. So in this, about 240,000 gigawatt per hour would be the one sufficient to, or would be the one sufficient, or that corresponds to the growth scenario of having a 7% growth for the strong growth scenario of the Philippine economy. So now, we're focusing on the generation sector, and just to give you a context on why the focus on the fuel mix. So at that time that we were asked to contribute to Filipino 2040, the debate in the electricity sector is about the fuel mix. I think at that time the DOE has just released the circular, the circular that said to maintain at least 30% share of renewable in the generation or in the installed capacity. And then we've attended one presentation, I think this is in MOA SMX. So it is put out there that there's the balanced aspiration of the government, which is saying 30-30-10 fuel mix, 30-30-10 fuel mix. So meaning 30% coal, 30% gas, 30% renewable, and 10% others. So this particular fuel mix is not in the circular itself. Like what I've said, the circular just say maintaining a 30% share. And even the DOE then is asking what is the optimal fuel mix. So this one is just for it. I think when we heard the presentation, this is what they call a balanced aspiration. Okay, so now what we're going to do is to focus on the fuel mix, and we're going to the paper, the exercise is trying to show what if you change the fuel mix. What would that imply to the generation price, the 47% that we have in the bill, because it's the biggest portion. So that's what the exercise is all about. So we're presenting several, what we call in the paper, policy regime on fuel mix. So the other alternative, if it's not policy 1, the 30-30-10, would be what we call utilization of lower cost resources, but one that takes into account environmental costs. What are these environmental costs? This would be carbon emissions. If you want to include local pollution costs, you can also do that, because it would also have an implication on the health. So that's what we mean when we say taking into account environmental costs. But policy 2 is the utilization of lower cost resources. Now, in consideration of the Renewable Energy Act, we also include, for illustration purposes, what if we increase the use of conventional renewables? For the Philippines, the conventional renewables would be hydro and geothermal, because we already have them. But of course, we have a caveat in the paper that we're not considering the hard constraints here. It's for illustration purposes. Hard constraint meaning we may run out of those reserves for those natural resources. So it's just for illustration that what if we increase the share of conventional renewables, what would happen to the price? Okay, and then the last policy regime on fuel mix is this increased use of variable renewables and biomass. Variable renewables would be solar and wind, because of the intermittency nature of its generation, and then biomass. So this is what's the focus of the Renewable Energy Act, so maintaining a 30% share. Okay, so now, in the computation, even if you want to increase, let's say, the share of coal or the sale of renewable, you have to consider that for the Philippines, we are an island, and hence we have this 3 grid pertaining to Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. So location matters, and the load requirement also matters. The load requirement being the base load. So base load would be the one that we use constantly for 24 hours. So the fuel generation, the power plant would depend on, or the power plant that you're going to put up would depend on what would be the demand or the load requirement. So for Luzon, the base load would typically be coal and also natural gas. Whereas for Visayas, it's largely also coal, but also some geothermal. And then for Mindanao, it's largely hydro. So even if you want to put more of those fuel, it would really depend on the load requirement and also, of course, the available fuel sources. So now, having that, this is the number that we have, our assumptions with regard to the 4 policy regimes on fuel mix. So starting from what we have in 2016, which is, I'm not sure if you can see the figure. For coal, right now, or in 2016, it's 35%. Natural gas, it's 15%. Conventional RE is 29%. Variable RE is 4%. And others is 16%. So we want to have the 30-30-10 by 2040. So we have this in 2040. Okay, and then utilization of the lower cost resource. So let me just go back to this one. This is an ADB energy outlook. So the ADB 2013 energy outlook says that for Asia and the Pacific, it would still be largely coal, and even for the Philippines, it would still be largely coal given its projection on its price. So the coal here is the black one. So they have these 2 scenarios, also a business as usual and alternative case. So that is where we base this utilization of the lower cost resource, which would be coal, and by 2040, we will have this fuel mix of 49, 14, 27, 2, and 5. And then for the increased utilization of conventional renewables, the one that would be high here would be the hydro and the geothermal. And then for the increased utilization of variable renewable and biomass, it would be this one. Again, you cannot just increase those shares because of the load requirement and the type of technology that would satisfy those load requirements. So that is the 4 policy regimes with regards to fuel mix used and we're going to use these four policy regimes to illustrate what's the effect on the prices that we're paying. So now, we have several assumptions on what would be the possible trajectory of fuel prices. It's 5 cases. So for each of these cases, we're going to illustrate the 4 policy regimes. So it's going to be 4 times 5, about 20 scenarios all in all. Case 1, this is what we call baseline. So the policy 1 would be using the 2015 prices and assuming it constant for the next 24 years. Policy 2, 3, and 4, so that would be utilization of the lower cost resource, increased use of conventional renewable, and increasing use of variable renewable. But it would have to take into account emission charges. So those emission charges will also remain constant for the next 24 years. Now, case 2. Case 2 is actually one of the comments that we received, if I'm not mistaken, from NEDA. Since they said that since FIT is already in place, why not use the degression rates to kind of simulate what would be the price of renewable in the future, since the current policy does not really say when it's going to end. So we use the degression rates in all renewable prices for policy 1 to 4. And then case 3 is where we ask, so here it says annual decrease in average RE prices by 3% in policies 1 to 4 again. So in this case 3, we just did a bottom-up exercise where we ask how much would the price of solar must go down at the minimum so that that policy 4 would perform best, meaning it would have an impact, it would have a greater impact in the price, in the 47% that we're paying. So that's case 3. Case 4 is where you have this, so thanks to GIZ for this suggestion and also NREL USAID, they provided us with reference that the historical prices of solar is going down by 8%. So again, this is just a variant of case 3 because case 3 just asks at the minimum by how much on average renewable would have to go down. So we combine it with annual decrease in the price of solar by 8% and annual decrease in the other renewables by 3%. And then case 5, this is where all prices change simultaneously. So we have this, it's downloadable, an EIA projection on fuel price. So we just apply its growth to the 2015 prices. So all prices would be in pesos per kilowatt hour. So now going back here to policy 2, 3, and 4, which incorporates emission charges. So we're using this the social cost of carbon. So this is an estimate in dollars of the long-term damage caused by a 1-ton increase in global carbon emissions in a given year. So that is what we're using. So policies 2, 3, and 4 would include this emission charge for the next 24 years. So what we do to have a number on this is to get the an estimate of the global SCC. So we just use an average of what Nordhaus and the US EPA have. Okay, so I only have 2 minutes. If you want, I can go to the results directly. Oh, in any case, we have this social cost of carbon. So the carbon emissions would go down, would be about $1.23 per megawatt hour or 0.05 pesos per kilowatt hour. So, okay, this is the prices that we use. Okay, so this is for case 1. Case 1 is constant price for the next 24 years for policy 1, but policy 2, 3, and 4 would have emission charge. Okay, so the result is for the price, okay, this is just the generation charge. For the strong growth scenario for the economy, policy 2 results in lower blended generation charges with downscaled, using downscaled emission charge. So let me explain first. So downscaled, I forgot to explain this. Downscaled means that The SCC is $25 per metric ton of CO2, right? But considering the Philippine share of damages, because it's social cost of carbon for the world. So considering for the Philippines, the share of damages would be about 5%, the carbon tax would be about 1.25 metric ton per CO2. And then converting the coal, 1 megawatt hour from coal generates about 0.98 metric tons of CO2, so we have about 0.05 emission charge. So that's what we mean by downscaled. So incorporating the emission charge, policy two is the utilization of the lesser cost resource. So this is the case because we're in this case one, prices are constant, and right now coal is still the cheapest, so that would have more coal in the fuel mix. So in this case, policy 2 performs better among the 4 policy regimes. Now, case 2, 3, and 4, these are the prices that we use. So it says there all the what we mean by case 2, 3, and 4. So it's only the price of renewable that's changing for all the policies. So this is the average of FIT. We're using the 2016 ERC circular. So this is the current FIT rates, but according to that circular, wind, solar will not be degressed anymore, but only for biomass hydro. So the average would be about 7.16 in 2016, and then the degression rate would be 0.5% thereafter, every 2 years. And then case 3, you have the 3% decrease, and then case 4, solar and other RE would decrease as well. So the results, if we incorporate FIT, policy 2 still results in lower blended generation charges by 2040. So pareho lang ng result ng case 1, even if may FIT. Case 3, so remember, case 3 is a bottom-up exercise. So we just asked at the minimum by how much would RE price have to go down for policy 4 to perform best. So in this case, since policy 2 is really utilization of lesser cost resource, so at that by then renewable would be the lesser cost resource. Although we're not already tinkering with the fuel mix, just the price. So in this case, policy 4 transformed into policy 2. And case 4 is just a variant of policy 3. So of course, again, policy 4 transformed into policy 2. Now, case 5, this is the more interesting case. So applying the projection of EIA to the current current prices that we have, this is the growth for each of these fuel sources. So applying this, case 5 results in, again, policy 2 here favors utilization of lower cost resource in this case, because projection of EIA by 2040, this would be, coal would still be cheaper relative to the other fuel prices. Now, going back to the scenario, the strong and weak growth, strong growth capacity naturally or expectedly would require more installed capacity. So, just 3 more slides. Objective, again, is to improve the well-being of the Filipinos. We're using the price because when we looked at the expenditure of the Filipinos, electricity still came out to be about number 3 outside of food. So we illustrate that the fuel mix is not constant over time, but should exploit the opportunities opened up by less costly resources while taking into account environmental costs to bring the cost of power down. In our computation, we only included carbon emissions, but we said that pollution costs, it may actually be larger. But we don't have a number for the local pollution cost. So again, that's another area of study that we should look at. It may actually be higher than the carbon emission. And if we incorporate that, coal would be, the price of coal would be higher. So we may see a different results than that we've shown here. So the government can facilitate a more competitive environment by letting the market work with full implementation of ARCOA. So the industry has already been deregulated. So the generation sector, when we talk to the generation industry player, they actually have their own portfolio mix. So they respond to market signals. But we're saying here, because right now it's still kind of passed on. So the vision of EPIRA is to make ARCOA work. That's the end of EPIRA. So what we're saying is government can facilitate this competitive environment, but we have to implement the ARCOA. Vision vs. long-term plan. So like what I've said, this is part of the exercise of NEDA. A vision is not a plan. Let us remind ourselves that it is a set of long-term goals based on the standard of living that Filipinos want to have in 25 years or so. One needs a long-term plan to realize the vision, but always a long-term plan cannot be etched in stone because many things can change along the way. So by 2040, we would have to undergo about 4 administrations. So what's important is we have that vision. It would be up to the different administration how to reach that vision. So again, the goal is to improve the well-being of the Filipinos. So we just focus on the price. But we're saying that it's really about the food, energy security, which is accessibility, affordability, and reliability. So we've just focused on the generation sector. There's a lot of things to do. Key reforms are needed for the sector to contribute to the overall vision. We're just running it through. We did not have time to really look on all of this in the paper. Investment coordination in generation, transmission, and distribution. Government investment in transmission highway. This is the NGCP. Regulatory oversight coordination in support of a competitive market and reconciling 2 seemingly contradicting instruments, EPIRA and RE law. Let me just flash all the research team who contributed to this paper. This is already 2 years in the making. Thank you.